Today we'll explore some of the stories behind the most dangerous, interesting, and even amusing rivalries in the world of geopolitics. We'll look at countries that could very well trigger the end of the world due to their intense hatred for each other, as well as those whose rivalries have actually helped them. Let's watch it. It's fascinating. The two Koreas. Usually when two countries share the same name, you can bet they can't stand each other, and this is certainly true for North Korea and South Korea. In fact, it's hard to think of two countries more embroiled in hostility than they are today. But what happened for them to hate each other so much? Well, it's a monstrous consequence of World War II and later the Cold War, which unfortunately continues to this day. You see, things started off poorly when Korea, which was then a single country, was annexed by Japan in 1910. This colonization, which was quite brutal, lasted until the end of World War II in 1945. After Japan's surrender, Korea was liberated, but like many countries freed from Axis powers, it ended up divided between the two victors of the war, the Soviet Union, which took the north, and the United States, which occupied the south, splitting the country at the 38th parallel. Following this traumatic beginning, the Cold War deepened the ideological rift between the Koreas. The North fell under the influence of communism, backed by the Soviet Union and China, while the South embraced capitalism, supported by the United States. In 1948, two separate governments were established: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, under Syngman Rhee. The tension between these two opposing governments escalated quickly, and in 1950, the Korean War broke out when North Korea, with support from the Soviets and Chinese, invaded South Korea. The war lasted until 1953 and ended with an armistice, but not with a formal peace treaty, meaning that technically, both countries are still at war, although the situation seems to have frozen. After the war, both nations took very different paths. North Korea became a one-party communist state with a planned economy and a strong emphasis on military self-sufficiency, gradually isolating itself from the rest of the world, while South Korea adopted a capitalist system and eventually became a democracy, emerging as one of the most prosperous countries. Today, tensions continue, with provocations from both sides. For example, South Korea is known to play K-pop at high volumes near the border, while North Korea threatens missile launches and sends balloons filled with trash to its southern neighbors. Greece and Turkey. Sometimes, the bitter rivalries between certain countries aren't rooted in events that happened a couple of years ago, or even in the 20th century, but rather are rivalries that have persisted for centuries. Such is the case with Greece and Turkey, who have been on bad terms since, well, pretty much since they came into existence. In this case, the animosity dates back to the rapid expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. When the Ottomans defeated the Byzantines, they took over all of Greece and held it for 400 years, only relinquishing it in 1830 when Greece fought for its independence. Believe me, during those years, Greece had a rough time. As a predominantly Orthodox Christian nation, the Greeks were treated as second-class citizens in their own land under Muslim Ottoman rule. So even before there was a real Greek or Turkish state, these two already had issues. The situation didn't improve after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, as Greeks and Turks fought over certain territories. Although the Turks won, the victory wasn't decisive enough to clearly establish who controlled the lands, leading to unresolved territorial disputes, and there remain tensions over the sovereignty of certain islands and areas in the Aegean Sea to this day. Strangely, both countries are NATO members, so in theory, they are military allies and would be obligated to help each other in case of a third-party attack. But in practice, they hate each other. So rather than saying two people get along like cats and dogs, you might as well say they get along like Greece and Turkey. The Arepa, Colombian or Venezuelan? Many of the rivalries we've discussed are extremely serious, so let's lighten the mood with one that's a bit more fun. Now, I know that as soon as we mention this rivalry, the comments section is going to turn into a battlefield. So let's try to keep it civil. That said, we'll talk about one of the most curious rivalries between countries: the origin of the arepa. One of the most interesting rivalries in Latin America is the ongoing debate between Colombia and Venezuela over who owns the arepa. Now, what we know is that this is an ancestral dish that has been consumed since, Well, since domesticated corn made its way to northern South America, so the arepa predates both countries by a long shot. However, the first archaeological record of something resembling the arepa dates back 3,000 years to the Muisca culture, which lived in the Cundiboyachense highlands in present-day Colombia. So if we want to get technical, we could give a point to those who claim the arepa is Colombian. But the story doesn't end there, as something similar was already being eaten on the other side of the border around the same time. The term arepa comes from the word arepa, which was used by the Kumanagoto tribe to refer to the dish. And these people were native to what are now the states of Sucre and Anzoátegui in Venezuela. Therefore, the word for the dish definitely comes from Venezuela. So that gives a point to those who believe the arepa is Venezuelan. Let's settle this in the comments. Where do you think the arepa comes from, Colombia or Venezuela? Argentina and Brazil. Fortunately, in Latin America, rivalries between countries are somewhat less lethal than in other parts of the world. Here, for better or worse, we recognize that we all come from similar origins, which helps us not tear each other apart. But that doesn't mean there aren't some rivalries, only that they manifest in a somewhat friendlier way, like the rivalry between Brazil and Argentina, which is akin to those rivalries in anime where they can't stand each other but also can't live without one another. As you can imagine, soccer is undoubtedly the most visible and passionate aspect of the rivalry between Argentina and Brazil. Both countries have a rich football tradition and have produced some of the greatest players and teams in the history of the sport. There's always been a struggle to see who is the best, and since both have an abundance of football stars, there are constant debates over who deserves the title of the best in the world. With names like Maradona, Messi, Pelé, and Ronaldinho, it's tough to determine who really holds the title. Historically, Argentina and Brazil have competed for influence in South America. In the 19th century, following their respective independences, both countries found themselves embroiled in shifting conflicts and alliances. Throughout the 20th century, Argentina and Brazil viewed each other as rivals in the quest for regional leadership. They are like the yin and yang of South America. One cannot exist without the other. China and Japan. These are perhaps the two most powerful countries in the Far East, with a long and complicated cultural history, but they are definitely not friends. In fact, their animosity is one of the most significant, long-standing, and infamous rivalries in all of Asia. For a long time, ancient Japan used to import many of its cultural traditions from China, and there was great respect from the island toward China. Thus, there are many ancient traditions they share. However, this respect gradually faded over the centuries as Chinese dynasties became increasingly unstable. By the late 19th century, Japan adopted a policy of military expansion in Asia, which led to the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895. This couldn't have come at a worse time for China, which was undergoing tremendous internal and external weakness. The war resulted in China's defeat and the cession of Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. This was followed by the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and merged into World War II. Japanese troops invaded and occupied large parts of China, committing numerous atrocities. It's important to emphasize that these events left a deep scar on China's historical memory and continue to fuel pain and resentment toward Japan. For example, there is deep resentment toward Japan due to visits by Japanese leaders to the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors Japanese soldiers, including war criminals, and this is seen by China as an affront and a lack of remorse from Japan. Today, both nations have territorial disputes over a group of islands in the East China Sea known as the Senkaku Islands in Japan and the Diaoyu Islands in China. Both countries claim sovereignty over these islands, which are located near important shipping routes and potential reserves of oil and gas. The tensions have led to multiple diplomatic and military confrontations, including naval and aerial patrols in the region. Seriously, any significant issue regarding these islands or the surrounding area could trigger a large-scale war. Belgium and Belgium? This country is made up of culturally distinct regions that, to be honest, have little in common with each other, to the point where they don't even speak the same language or share a common culture, and there's a certain dislike among them. Belgium consists of the northern region of Flanders, which speaks a Dutch dialect, and the southern region of Wallonia, which speaks a French dialect. Almost right in the middle of these two regions lies the capital, Brussels, where both languages are spoken. Now, this could simply be a regional division that you might find in any country, if not for the fact that both regions are culturally distinct and feel a certain rivalry between them. There was even an occasion when the government couldn't find representatives from both regions to jointly lead Belgium, which has led to discussions about partitioning the country. In the future, Belgium could potentially split into two. I suppose time will tell. In the meantime, we can say that Belgium is basically like that couple seriously contemplating divorce because they married very young and didn't know what they were doing. India and Pakistan. Sharing the same history with someone doesn't always mean you get along. In fact, sometimes that shared history can turn you into sworn enemies. This is exactly the case with India and Pakistan, two countries that can't stand each other. Whenever there's a sports event of any kind where these two countries face off, you can almost feel the tension in the air. But why do they hate each other so much? Well, it's actually the fault of the British and colonialism. You see, before the British arrived in India, the territories that today comprise India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were divided into hundreds of incredibly diverse princely states, some of which were Hindu, others Muslim, and still others Sikh. In many cases, multiple religions coexisted within the same principality, so you could find people from entirely different cultures living together without much trouble. Sure, there were tensions between Hindus and Muslims due to their diametrically opposed religions, but nothing the local authorities couldn't manage. Problems began to arise with the arrival of the British, as they took over from the local leaders but knew little or nothing about the complex relationships among the various cultures inhabiting the subcontinent. What they did know was that there were Hindus and Muslims among all the peoples, and instead of working to help them coexist, the British did everything they could to divide them so they would fight each other instead of working together to expel the British. Sadly, the divide and conquer strategy is all too true, and sometime later, when India sought its independence, these deep divisions sown by the British came to light in the worst way possible. During the decolonization process, Muslim communities feared that being a minority would lead to their abuse, while Hindus feared that the country would fracture into 1,000 pieces. The subcontinent was on the brink of civil war, and the British, eager to wash their hands of what would likely be an unprecedented massacre, decided to simply divide the country into three parts: the previously mentioned India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, with India for the Hindus and the other countries for the Muslims. It was a true disaster since communities with all sorts of religions existed throughout the subcontinent. This sharp division based on religion led to one of the largest and most brutal forced migrations ever recorded. 15 million people had to leave their homes, and it's estimated that 2 million people did not survive the horrific journey due to lack of food and the violence that erupted during the creation of Pakistan and India as we know them today. And of course, as the British were already on their way out, Indians and Pakistanis ended up blaming each other for these terrible events. Today, both countries maintain a bitter rivalry and continue to despise each other, but they share their Independence Day and celebrate it jointly at the border with parades and ceremonies, which we can see here. But still, you can even feel the tension in the air during the ceremony. China and the Vatican. These countries have had very strong disagreements, to the point that they severed relations entirely for a couple of years, and only recently managed to resolve things through diplomacy and the good faith of the Pope. Of course, you might wonder, what kind of disagreement could the Vatican have with China? I mean, they don't share a border, are culturally very distant from each other, and have little to no actual contact, so what would cause a fight? Well, it has to do with how the Vatican oversees the Church in other parts of the world, since in most countries, it's the Vatican that appoints and ordains bishops, who then obey papal authority. But as you might imagine, the Chinese are none too pleased about taking orders from external powers, especially from a European entity like the Vatican. That's why, after the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Party that took power cut all ties with the Vatican and created the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, an institution completely separate from the Vatican that selects the bishops for the country. This is no small matter, as there are more than 10 million Catholics in China. Today, the Vatican is attempting to officially recognize this association created by the Chinese, but there is much criticism from Catholics in the country who say they really don't trust the Communist Party and its selections for new bishops because they know the party knows nothing about religion and treats it all as a political game. Iran and Saudi Arabia. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States were fierce enemies, but they never openly declared war on each other. Well, something very similar happens with Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are sworn enemies but have never declared war openly, creating something of a mini Cold War encapsulating the entire Middle East, which is why there are so many unfortunate wars in that part of the world. Now, from an external perspective, this enmity isn't evident at all. Iran and Saudi Arabia are both Muslim theocracies governed by Sharia law, and both are countries that depend on oil, so they have a lot in common. One could think they would be obvious allies, but the reality, as often is the case, is more complicated than one might believe, and the devil is in the details. You see, Islam is not a monolith. There are two very distinct branches that can clash, Shiites and Sunnis, which have a division not unlike the one that existed in Christianity with Catholics and Orthodox in the 17th century. In this case, Saudi Arabia is the stronghold of Sunni Islam and sees itself as the leader of the Sunni Islamic world, while Iran is a predominantly Shiite state and believes it has a leadership role among Shiite Muslims. But if that weren't enough reason to create a Cold War, there's also the fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia are two of the leading powers in the Middle East, both seeking to expand their influence over the countries in the region, leading to a power struggle in addition to the religious conflict. And to top it off, there's also an economic battle, as both Iran and Saudi Arabia are significant oil producers, and the economies of both countries largely depend on exports. In this scenario, any move by either of the two giants could disrupt the export model of the other, so they are constantly vying for economic control of oil. Ghana and Nigeria. Many of the rivalries we've seen are quite serious and have historically led to terrible things like wars. However, some rivalries between countries are a bit more playful, and moreover, instead of causing destruction, they've spurred cultural advancements for their rivals, like the curious case of Ghana and Nigeria. These two are fierce rivals when it comes to music, football, and rice. Yes, just as you heard, let me explain. Both countries share a cultural heritage and similar traditions. They both descend from the prosperous empires that existed in sub-Saharan Africa and have a very similar colonial past, as both Ghana and Nigeria were British colonies, leading to similarities in their political, educational, and legal systems. However, after their independence, a competition emerged to become the most powerful regional influence. Imagine a family with two older brothers competing to be the role models for the younger siblings. That's somewhat what these countries are like for the region. The rivalry takes many forms. For example, football has become a genuinely contentious issue for them, as Ghana's national team, known as the Black Stars, and Nigeria's Green Eagles are intensely competitive, creating huge excitement in both countries. When they face off in the African Cup final, both nations completely stop to watch the matches. Similarly, Ghana and Nigeria are artistically competitive, as their musicians try to outdo each other in regional popularity, and African film industries are emerging in both countries, aiming to compete in terms of production quality. But perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of their rivalry is culinary, as both countries prepare jollof rice, a delicious type of rice cooked in tomato paste with onion and various spices like pepper and nutmeg. However, Ghana and Nigeria can never agree on what the original recipe is or which is the best, so whenever the two communities meet, there are always extremely long discussions about it. So yes, Ghana and Nigeria are rivals, but in a good way, as their rivalry has fostered a healthy sense of competition that has propelled development in various areas, making them two of the most influential and dynamic nations in West Africa. Armenia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. It's one thing to have a neighbor you can't stand, but it's quite another to be literally surrounded by your worst enemies. Sadly, this is the reality that Armenia is facing. You see, this is a small but surprisingly ancient country of Indo-European descent located in the northern Middle East, nestled between Turkey and Azerbaijan. It was the first nation to adopt Christianity as its official religion in 300 AD, and naturally, Christianity is a fundamental part of its identity. However, this has played against Armenia, as it sits squarely between two famously Muslim nations that actually share a common origin. Thus, Turkey and Azerbaijan have always been allies and have never been very fond of Armenia. In fact, they are sworn enemies, and, well, nothing good can come from being surrounded by your worst enemies. Throughout history, there have been terrible massacres where both Turks and Azerbaijanis have decimated Armenian populations, leading Armenia to want nothing to do with its neighbors to the point of not even having embassies in either country. Moreover, there have been territorial wars between Armenians and Azerbaijanis recently, all over a region known as Nagorno-Karabakh, which is disputed between the two. However, it's not all bad news. For the past 2 years, Armenians and Turks have been trying to normalize their diplomatic relations, although the efforts have been considerably slow. Belarus and Poland. A single leader can turn two countries that were historically neutral toward each other into fierce enemies. And if you don't believe me, let's take a look at the grim history of how Belarus and Poland became foes in just a couple of decades. Most of us were alive when the conflict began. The key to this enmity lies in the leadership of Alexander Lukashenko, the current president of Belarus, infamously known as the last dictator of Europe. This nickname suits him well, as he has participated in multiple fraudulent elections, and there's basically no chance he'll relinquish the presidency as long as he lives. Of course, this doesn't sit well with the European Union. Since Lukashenko clung to power, they have imposed more and more sanctions on Belarus. Poland, as a member of the EU and NATO, and as a neighbor to Belarus, has taken a strong stance against him. Because of this, Poland views Belarus as a pawn in Russia's sphere of influence and has strongly criticized Lukashenko's policies, particularly regarding human rights and the lack of democracy. Tensions have intensified, especially after the crisis in Ukraine, where Poland has firmly supported Ukrainian territorial integrity and opposed Russia's actions, while Belarus has aligned itself more closely with Moscow. Belarus retaliated against this opposition in a despicable manner. In 2021, it facilitated the passage of thousands of migrants from the Middle East to the Polish border. Then, in a truly wicked act, it closed its doors on the migrants it had helped, leaving them trapped at the Polish border and creating a migrant crisis in that country. Naturally, this dirty trick was seen by Poland and the EU as an attempt by Lukashenko to destabilize his neighbors in retaliation for the sanctions imposed on his regime. So yes, unfortunately, one person can indeed create enmity between two entire countries. Sudan and South Sudan. And here we have two more countries that split into a southern and a northern version of themselves. Sudan and South Sudan, which in fact is the newest country in the world with just 13 years of existence. Wow, most of us are older than South Sudan. But what happened for Sudan to split in two so recently in history? Well, it's a long and cruel story. Sudan is a country that has always had significant religious and ethnic divisions. The north is predominantly populated by people of Arab descent, who are Muslim. Meanwhile, the south of Sudan consists of various African ethnicities that practice Christianity and several traditional African religions. During the British-Egyptian colonial period from 1899 to 1956, these differences only grew, as northern Sudan received much more attention than the south, which was under a separate administrative system, resulting in fewer resources and less development. After gaining independence in 1956, this inequality continued, which unfortunately sparked two long civil wars between the North and South. Both were caused by the South's resistance to the imposition of policies from the central government, including the implementation of Islamic law and the centralization of power, actions that only deepened the inequality. The Second Sudanese Civil War ended with the signing of a peace agreement between the Sudanese government and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the main rebel group from the South. The agreement granted autonomy to the South for 6 years and stipulated that a referendum would be held in 2011 to determine whether the South would opt for independence. Indeed, an overwhelming majority, almost 99%, voted in favor of independence. As you can imagine, the people of South Sudan harbored deep resentment toward those from the North for the oppression they endured throughout this process. But fortunately, the separation is now more than official in the eyes of international organizations, though the region remains quite unstable. Who knows what the future holds for these two countries? Let's hope they can coexist peacefully. Myanmar and Bangladesh. Sometimes international hatred can lead to some of the world's greatest tragedies, such as what is currently happening between Myanmar and Bangladesh. Although, technically speaking, the animosity isn't just between these two nations. It's something much more complex. The conflict is primarily centered around the humanitarian and political crisis of the Rohingya, a Muslim minority that has faced decades of discrimination, persecution, and violence in Myanmar, a predominantly Buddhist country. The Rohingya have lived for centuries in Rakhine State in Myanmar. However, the Myanmar government does not recognize them as citizens, claiming they are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. In 1982, Myanmar enacted a citizenship law that effectively rendered the Rohingya stateless, denying them citizenship and basic rights. The conflict escalated significantly in 2012 when clashes erupted between the Rohingya and the Buddhist population in Rakhine State. This violence was exacerbated by nationalist rhetoric and the state's tacit support for Buddhist groups. The conflict peaked in August 2017 when the Myanmar army launched a military operation in response to attacks by an insurgent group. The military's response was disproportionate and resulted in a massive exodus of Rohingya to Bangladesh. Over 700,000 crossed the border in a short period, joining hundreds of thousands who had already fled in previous decades. This made Bangladesh home to one of the largest refugee camps in the world. Sadly, they live in extremely difficult conditions, facing overcrowding, lack of adequate access to basic services, and total dependence on humanitarian aid. Thus, Myanmar's hatred toward the Rohingya forced Bangladesh to deal with a migrant crisis that was not of its making, which, as you can imagine, has generated significant tensions between the two countries. It's an example of how hatred can be a very dangerous thing that can ruin thousands of lives. Vietnam and Cambodia, two countries that may seem quite similar to the rest of the world, can have enough cultural differences to breed hatred and even acts of violence, just as is the case with Vietnam and Cambodia. Although these countries share common histories, their animosity has deep historical, cultural, and political roots that have developed over centuries. The history dates back to the time of the Khmer Empire, approximately between the 9th and 15th centuries, when Cambodia was a regional power in Southeast Asia. During this period, the Khmer controlled a vast territory that included parts of what is now Vietnam. However, as the empire declined, the Kingdom of Vietnam, then known as Jai Viet, began expanding southward, gradually causing Cambodia to lose significant parts of its territory, including the Mekong Delta region, which is one of the most fertile and strategic areas in Vietnam today. This expansion contributed to a historical sense of resentment among Cambodians toward Vietnamese people, and it didn't get any better over time. Throughout the centuries, there have been intermittent conflicts between them, with invasions and military occupations from both sides. During the French colonial period, both countries fell under French influence, which moderated but did not eliminate tensions. Hostility intensified during and after the Vietnam War. Initially, Cambodia tried to remain neutral, but its territory was used by both North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong to launch attacks against the South Vietnamese government, leading to bombing campaigns and U.S. military operations in Cambodia. And that was just the beginning of a terrible era for Southeast Asia. After the Vietnam War, the communist regime of the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, took control of Cambodia in 1975, resulting in disaster for all, bringing only destruction. The Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, which lasted until 1989, is one of the main reasons for modern animosity. During this period, the government installed by Vietnam, led by Hun Sen, faced resistance from both the Khmer Rouge and other Cambodian factions opposed to Vietnamese influence. The Vietnamese occupation was internationally condemned, and many countries supported Cambodian factions fighting against the Vietnam-backed government. This situation led to a prolonged conflict that only began to resolve with the Paris Peace Accords in 1991, which eventually resulted in the withdrawal of Vietnamese forces and international oversight for political transition in Cambodia. The occupation left deep distrust between the countries, and border disputes between Cambodia and Vietnam have persisted over the years, even after the end of the Vietnamese occupation. These disputes mainly focus on land demarcation and rights over areas in the Mekong Delta. So now you know, two seemingly similar countries can be the most bitter of enemies. Now tell us in the comments, do you know of any others that you'd like us to talk about? Here are two options that you'll surely love.